A single father notices a hungry little girl staring at his daughter's food in an expensive restaurant, but what begins as an act of compassion quickly unravels into a high-stakes trap, exposing corruption, crimes, and a mastermind plan years in the making. This is a story about justice, deception, and the downfall of a powerful man who underestimated the wrong woman. The evening crowd at the Golden Spoon buzzed softly, crystal glasses clinking and polished silverware chiming under warm golden lights. David Martinez guided his daughter Sophia to their table, trying to mask the tiredness beneath his eyes. He wanted this dinner to feel special, something normal, something joyful, despite the months of struggle after losing his wife and his job. Sophia, always observant, sat down and immediately noticed a little girl at the next table. The girl, maybe 6 or 7, peeked repeatedly at Sophia's plate, her small eyes following every movement of the fork as if each bite were a reminder of her own empty stomach. David's heart squeezed. He knew that look too well. The one Sophia used to have when money was tight and meals were uncertain. The girl's mother, a woman named Rachel, sat stiffly across from her, counting a handful of crumpled dollars with trembling fingers. Her shoulders were hunched, her clothes neat but worn, and her face carried the strained smile of someone accustomed to pretending everything was fine. David looked away for a moment, swallowing memories of nights spent calculating bills, choosing between groceries and rent. He had clawed his way back into stability, but the fear lingered. When the waiter approached Rachel's table, she ordered only a bowl of soup in a voice so soft it almost dissolved in the air. She glanced at her daughter with a painful mixture of guilt and determination, as though she were forcing herself to choose the cheapest option to make the money stretch. But the moment the waiter walked away, something shifted. Rachel slipped her phone out, lowering her volume, but not her confidence. Her tone sharpened, her posture straightened, and the fragile woman counting bills seemed to vanish. It couldn't hear the full conversation, but he caught enough fragments, phrases said with authority, not desperation. It didn't make sense. One second, she looked like a mother fighting to afford a simple meal. The next, she was someone in control, someone calculating. When she hung up, she returned to her nervous Fakaday, head bowed, fingers tracing the rim of her glass. The sudden change unsettled David, stirring the part of him that always evaluated people, looking for the truth hidden between gestures. Something wasn't adding up. He tried to focus on Sophia, who chatted about her school project, but his attention pulled back to Rachel's table when an aroma of strong cologne swept through the room. A tall, impeccably dressed man approached Rachel with a stiff, corporate smile. Richard Patterson. David recognized him instantly. His pictures were everywhere: real estate magazines, news articles, exposes about unethical practices. He was a CEO who disguised greed as business, a man whose company forced families out of their homes for profit, a man who built luxury condominiums on the ruins of low-income neighborhoods. David had researched him years ago when fighting to keep his own building from being bought out. Richard was powerful, wealthy, untouchable, and now he was walking straight toward the nervous woman and her supposedly hungry child. The moment Richard sat down, the table transformed. Emma, who moments earlier had looked ready to cry from hunger, now brightened like a switch had been flipped. She giggled, tapping gleefully on an expensive tablet that she pulled from her small backpack. It was too new, too advanced, too opposite of the hungry little girl staring at food moments earlier. Rachel's demeanor changed too. Her nervousness faded as soon as Richard settled into the seat. The shy, fragile mother became composed, her eyes steadily following every movement Richard made. The waiter returned, and Richard, without even glancing at the menu, ordered the most expensive dishes with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to indulgence. There was no sign of financial struggle, no hesitation, no hunger. David's suspicion deepened. The pieces didn't match the struggling mother, the starving child, the sudden confidence, the wealthy man, the expensive tablet, and above all, why was a woman who seemed to be counting coins meeting one of the richest, most ruthless men in the city? David felt his stomach tighten as he studied Richard's face. This was the man who had caused countless families to lose their homes, the man whose decisions had crushed people like him. the man whose signature alone could uproot entire communities. Yet here he was, sitting with a woman who had been playing the part of someone desperate. And the little girl who had seemed so hungry was now distracted, cheerful, unfazed. David leaned back slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't charity, and it wasn't coincidence. Something was unfolding in front of him. Something deliberate. Something orchestrated and, for reasons he couldn't yet explain. David sensed that he had stepped into the opening scene of a much larger story. David couldn't shake the uneasiness from his chest. The more he watched the strange trio at the nearby table, the more he felt like he was seeing only the surface of something deeper. When Richard stepped away to take a call, David pulled out his phone and typed in the name he'd heard the waiter use earlier, Rachel Carter. The search results loaded instantly, and what appeared on the screen made his pulse quicken. Rachel wasn't a struggling mother or a random diner. She was a civil rights attorney known for taking on impossible cases and winning them through relentless investigation. And her biggest current lawsuit was against none other than Richard Patterson's real estate empire, accusing the company of discriminatory evictions and predatory redevelopment tactics that targeted minority and low-income families. As he scrolled further, David realized this was no coincidence. The Golden Spoon was a known haunt of wealthy businessmen, especially Richard. Rachel had come here deliberately, and the act she put on earlier, the nervousness. The tight budget, the worn-out clothes was a performance crafted with precision. She wasn't here for dinner. She was here for evidence. David's gaze drifted back to Rachel. Now that he knew who she was, everything suddenly came together with chilling clarity. She wasn't simply clutching a menu. She was angling it just perfectly to hide the recording device clipped inside. Her hands barely moved, but the tiny green light reflected for a split second when the candles flickered. Emma's expensive tablet also made sense now. It wasn't a toyette, it was a transcription device disguised in a child-friendly shell, quietly converting Richard's voice into encrypted text. Every careless, arrogant word he uttered was being saved. Every detail was being documented. Rachel and Emma weren't just mother and daughter, they were a team in the middle of a high-risk operation, gathering the very evidence that could dismantle Richard's empire from the inside. When Richard returned to the table, he was even more reckless than before, unaware that two sets of sharp eyes and expertly hidden devices were capturing everything. He leaned back with the smugness of a man who believed himself untouchable. He bragged about bribes like they were business deals. He laughed about controlling judges, manipulating politicians, greasing hands at City Hall. He spoke openly about using aggressive tactics, forcing tenants out, hiring muscle to intimidate families, speeding up evictions, even when children and the elderly had nowhere to go. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't hide a thing. It was as if he enjoyed hearing himself talk, relishing the power he held over people's lives. David listened, horrified, but unable to look away. Richard discussed secret payments to the sheriff's department to ensure evictions went smoothly and without too many questions. He mentioned demolishing an entire neighborhood without completing the legally required environmental review, laughing about how the fines were cheaper than the delays. But the moment that froze David's blood was when Richard ordered the immediate removal of the Riverside families over the phone in a public restaurant because he wanted construction to begin early. David knew Riverside. He knew the people. He knew the fear that hung over them like a permanent shadow. And Richard was condemning them all with a casual flick of his wrist while sipping expensive wine. David's hand clenched around his glass. He couldn't stay silent anymore. When Rachel glanced in his direction, their eyes locked for a brief moment, and he made a subtle gesture to fingers tapping the table, then his chest, then pointing toward Richard. It wasn't a universal signal, but it carried meaning. Asterisk, I know, and I can help. Asterisk, Rachel's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. She recognized the language of quiet allies. When Richard stepped away again, Rachel lowered the menu a fraction. Studying David with calculated caution, he leaned slightly forward as if adjusting his napkin and whispered just loudly enough for her to read his lips. Asterisk, Riverside. I have proof. Asterisk. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but in recognition. He wasn't just another bystander. He was part of the very story she was trying to expose. Rachel slid her phone across her lap. typing quickly without breaking eye contact. A moment later, David's phone buzzed. A message appeared from an unknown number. Asterisk, meet me at the back entrance of the cafe next door. 7 p.m. do not be followed. Asterisk, David exhaled shakily. This was real. This was dangerous. And he was now woven into the thread of it. He thought of the photos he'd taken during his nonprofit housing investigations, the illegal notices, the frightened families, the testimonies from displaced tenants. He thought of the nights he'd stayed awake compiling evidence no one wanted to look at. He thought of how powerless he'd felt. But now, sitting in the same room as the man responsible, next to the attorney brave enough to challenge him, everything felt different. For the first time, the pieces were aligning. As Richard laughed loudly at something outside, oblivious to the storm forming around him, David realized that tonight wasn't just a coincidence. It was an intersection of paths meant to collide. And at 7 p.m., they would take the next step toward finishing what both of them had been fighting for in their own separate ways. Together, they finally had a real chance to bring the giant down. The warm glow of the chandeliers shimmered across the polished floors as a new presence entered the restaurant, calm, composed, and radiating authority. David noticed her immediately, a woman in a charcoal gray suit moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding courtrooms. This was Dr. Amanda Torres, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state, a woman whose victories against corrupt systems were legendary. She paused at the entrance, scanned the room with sharp, assessing eyes, and then nodded subtly toward Rachel's table. It was the quiet signal of a plan entering its final phase. When she approached, she didn't sit with them or speak aloud. Instead, she brushed near Rachel's chair and slipped a small encrypted drive into her hand. Her whisper was barely audible to David, even though he sat close enough to sense the tension. The recording is enough. Tonight's evictions are stopped. Rachel's relief flickered for only a heartbeat before she rearranged her mask of nervousness. The operation had reached its turning point. Richard, oblivious to the shift, sank back into his seat, swirling his wine with the careless arrogance of a man who believed the world belonged to him. If the earlier confessions were incriminating, what followed was practically a declaration of war against morality. With each sip, he felt bolder, louder, more untouchable. He laughed about having the mayor in his pocket, describing political favors like casual purchases. He boasted about how he could influence judges with a single phone call, sneering about how the courts were nothing but cooperative tools in his business strategy. He bragged about making millions through displacement, tearing families from their homes, pushing elderly tenants into homelessness, and turning entire neighborhoods into profit machines. His words were venomous, spilling out in a stream of self-worship and cruelty. Every detail, every confession, every malicious laugh was captured through Emma's device as she pretended to watch a cartoon. The tablet quietly translated Richard's voice into text, syncing it with audio logs stored in a cloud drive that could not be tampered with. The little girl's hands moved casually, but the intelligence behind her calm face was unmistakable. She knew exactly what she was recording and why. David watched, impressed, and horrified at the same time. It was surreal, this child sitting feet away from a man describing the destruction of families like her own. Yet she remained steady, professional in her small but vital role. Then, like the sudden crack of thunder, Richard's phone rang. His smile faltered when he saw the unknown number on the screen. He answered with irritation, but within seconds, the color drained from his face. David couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but he could read the reaction in Richard's tightening jaw, his trembling fingers, his eyes darting wildly around the room. The person speaking introduced themselves as an FBI agent. Richard's hand shook visibly now. He demanded to know what evidence they had, who had given it to them, what they were saying about him. But his voice cracked when the agent calmly informed him that they had his full recorded confession from bribes too. Forced evictions to illegal demolitions, everything. His arrogance evaporated, replaced with raw panic. He pushed back his chair so hard it nearly toppled, breathing in harsh, uneven gasps as he scanned the room for an escape that didn't exist. Rachel lifted her head slowly, no longer slouching, no longer trembling, no longer pretending. The transformation was striking. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried a controlled fury honed through years of fighting injustice. "Richard," she said softly, "you should sit down." He froze, recognizing something in her tone he had not heard before: power. His eyes narrowed in confusion as he stared at her, searching for the fragile woman he thought he'd been manipulating all evening. But she wasn't there. Rachel stood tall and unshakable. "My name is Rachel Carter," she said, her voice steady and cold. "I am the attorney investigating you, and everything you said tonight has been legally recorded." The restaurant fell into an unnatural stillness. Richard stumbled back, clutching the edge of the table as if it might save him. Rachel nodded toward the corners of the room. And suddenly several people previously disguised as diners, waiters, even a couple seated near the windows stood and revealed their badges. Undercover agents? They had been positioned throughout the restaurant the entire evening, monitoring, listening, protecting. The net had been cast long before Richard ever arrived, and now it was tightening with precision. He was surrounded. Richard's voice cracked as he tried to deny everything, but every word he spoke only tangled him deeper. Rachel laid out the truth with chilling clarity. She had orchestrated the entire scenario, the meeting, the location, the timing. The Mother in Distress Act was a strategy. Emma's tablet was state-authorized equipment. Every confession he had made was captured legally under active investigation protocols. Dr. Torres's presence confirmed the operation's airtight design. And David's arrival was the final reinforcement they hadn't planned for but now greatly valued. Richard looked around in desperation, but there was nowhere left to hide. In a single night, the empire he built on greed and cruelty had begun to crumble. The trap had closed, and he was caught squarely in the center. The moment the undercover agents stepped forward, Richard's panic erupted into full desperation. The FBI team moved with crisp precision, surrounding him before he could even attempt to flee. His breath came in ragged bursts as he backed into a corner, hands shaking uncontrollably. When the lead agent read him his rights, Richard's facade finally shattered. He stammered, pleaded, tried desperately to reclaim the arrogance he had flaunted all evening. But nothing surfaced except fear. Cold metal cuffs locked around his wrists, and in that single metallic click, the empire he had spent years building began to crumble. Outside the restaurant, unmarked cars waited, engines running, ready to pull him into the justice system he believed he controlled. But the unraveling didn't stop with him. Within hours, his corrupt partners, the judge he had bribed, the sheriff who carried out his illegal orders, even the mayor who accepted favors in exchange for political support, were all escorted out of their offices in handcuffs. Their power evaporated in the flashing lights of camera crews reporting their downfall. By morning, Richard's lawyers had withdrawn from representing him, refusing to be tied to a sinking ship. As the chaos settled, Rachel finally allowed herself to breathe. She turned to David, her expression softening from the steel she had worn all night. With the operation complete, she explained the truth that had fueled her relentless pursuit. Richard's company had displaced more than 300 families over the past decade, families who begged for mercy, who tried to fight back, who lost everything when their homes were torn down under the guise of development. Rachel had interviewed mothers who cried through depositions, children forced to live in shelters, elderly tenants found homeless after decades in the same building. Each story carved itself into her resolve. She had spent years gathering evidence that prosecutors dismissed as insufficient. Years facing threats, years watching powerful men slip through legal loopholes. Tonight wasn't just about winning a case, it was about ending a nightmare that had haunted hundreds. She wanted to make sure Richard Patterson would never again wield his influence to crush the vulnerable. And with his confession captured, his accomplices exposed, and his allies dismantled, she had finally succeeded. 6 months later, the world looked very different. Richard was now an inmate in a federal prison, no longer protected by power or wealth. His days of luxury were gone, replaced by stark walls and rigid schedules. The newspapers that once praised him as a visionary developer now chronicled his downfall in damning headlines. Investigations into his company uncovered layers of corruption that shocked even seasoned prosecutors. His financial empire crumbled as properties were seized and liquidated to compensate displaced families. Investors abandoned him, board members fled, and his name, once stamped on skyscrapers and luxury projects, became synonymous with greed and disgrace. Even behind bars, Richard could not escape the echo of his own arrogance, the words he had boasted now replaying as evidence against him. But while his world collapsed, new foundations were being built elsewhere. Rachel, now free from the shadows of a years-long investigation, opened her own housing rights law firm, a place built not on wealth or prestige, but on purpose. She filled the office with attorneys who had witnessed injustice firsthand, people dedicated to protecting vulnerable families from exploitation. Her firm quickly became a symbol of hope, taking on cases others considered too difficult or too risky. David, inspired by the courage he had seen that night and driven by his own history of loss and recovery, joined her as a partner. His experience with housing nonprofits and his commitment to protecting families brought a powerful new dimension to their mission. Together, they expanded their work across the state, using their combined expertise to challenge corrupt landlords, advocate for fair housing laws, and support communities long ignored by the system. Emma and Sophia, once strangers watching each other from neighboring tables, grew inseparable over time. Their friendship symbolized everything Rachel and David fought for: a future where children could grow up without fear of losing their homes, where the next generation learned to stand up to injustice with intelligence and compassion. The girls spent weekends together, studying, playing, and absorbing the values their parents worked tirelessly to uphold. Their laughter echoing in offices and community centers reminded everyone that rebuilding wasn't just about legal victories, but about restoring hope. In the end, the message that carried through every chapter of this story was clear. Justice was never about revenge. It wasn't about hurting those who caused pain. It was about outsmarting corruption with patience, dismantling arrogance with truth, and protecting the innocent with unwavering courage. Justice required strategy, intelligence, and heart. It demanded the bravery to face giants and the wisdom to wait for the right moment to strike. And when used correctly, it had the power not just to punish the guilty, but to reshape the future for everyone who had once felt powerless.